Avares IV had long been hailed as the planet of light, a glittering jewel in the crown of the Ascendancy's interstellar empire. Its platinum towers pierced the layers of manufactured sky, its shimmering energy rivers wound elegantly through crystal-paved boulevards. But to Cale Arden, all that light was nothing but a painted lie, a dazzling veil stretched thin over an abyss of horrors the Ascendancy desperately hid from the eyes of the galaxy. And buried deep beneath the radiant cities of Avares IV, hidden from the world's admiring gaze, lay the Lumen Vault, a monstrous factory where living souls were forged into prisons. The Eclipsed were not born to live. They were engineered, designed with meticulous cruelty through genetic sculpting and biotechnological alchemy, to serve a single, wretched purpose, to absorb all the dark emotions the Ascendancy's rulers refused to carry themselves. Fear, rage, lust, guilt, all the filth of the soul was poured into these beautiful vessels, drained from the mighty so they could conquer worlds with unblemished faces and pristine smiles. The Eclipsed were denied choice, denied feelings, denied the right to even exist for themselves. They endured, silent receptacles for every nightmare the Ascendancy would not acknowledge, until their bodies rotted, their minds fractured, and they were quietly discarded. Cale pulled the brim of his maintenance helmet low over his brow and walked through the first security gate, keeping his face neutral. His coveralls, patched and worn, had been carefully altered to bypass the molecular scanners lining the checkpoint. A former Solace Front operative, Cale was no stranger to infiltration. But this time, it wasn't sabotage that had brought him here. It was a promise, a debt he refused to leave unpaid. He had come to save Riven Calda, his closest comrade, the one who had once dragged him from the jaws of death on Lissar Prime, only to fall into captivity during the failed uprising on Avares IV. Objective: Emotion Containment Sector 7. Time limit: 30 minutes maximum. The silent flicker of his wrist scanner confirmed his route. No margin for mistakes. The automatic gate hissed open, revealing a colossal hall bathed in ghostly white light. Hundreds of glass containment pods stood in regimented rows, their faint luminescence casting an eerie glow. Inside each pod floated an Eclipsed, creatures of almost heartbreaking beauty, skin shimmering with hues no natural being could possess. Their eyes were open, unseeing, mirrors to a soul smothered long ago. Silver filaments and neural siphons coiled around them, linking them to the consciousness of Ascendancy generals and overlords, draining away their humanity so they could rule without conscience. Cale clenched his fists, nails biting into his palms. These children of light should have been free, soaring through the skies, not imprisoned as living waste receptacles. He moved swiftly down the maintenance catwalk, boots barely whispering against the metal grating. Everything was going according to plan, until, from a narrow, forgotten corridor branching off the main path, he heard it. A breath. Faint. Shivering. Not the mechanical hum of the vault's machinery, but the fragile whisper of something alive. Cale froze, instincts razor sharp. In a place like this, any deviation could mean death. And yet, he found himself turning, drawn by the sound. A dim green emergency light flickered, guiding him down the neglected corridor to a door half hanging off its hinges. Inside, dust lay thick on every surface. The ventilation whined a sickly note. No pods. No equipment. Only a single figure, slumped against a crumbling wall. Near a veil. The sight of her punched the air from Cale's lungs. She wasn't sealed in a containment pod like the others. No protective systems, no life support cables. Her wrists were shackled by aging silver electromag cuffs, wired into a rusted data port. She had been abandoned, not worth the effort of an execution. Her skin shimmered with the faintest glow of violet and blue, a ghostly radiance underlaid with thread-like streams of bioluminescence. Her hair, silver and soft as moonlight, spilled over her thin shoulders like a river frozen mid-flow. Unlike the blank, empty faces he had passed, hers bore the marks of sorrow. Deep. Ancient. Human. An ancient console next to her flickered weakly. Unit NV-17. Status, defective. Recommendation, terminate. But they hadn't bothered to kill her. They had simply forgotten her. Kale's wrist scanner blinked urgently. Less than 20 minutes left. He should have turned away. Should have focused on the mission. But his feet moved without asking permission. He knelt before her, so close he could see the tiny tremors in her frail form, the shallow rise and fall of her breath. "Can you hear me?" he whispered. No response. Only the ragged, feeble rhythm of survival. Kale's mouth twisted into a grimace, a crooked smile that tasted of salt and iron. "Where I come from," he murmured, "they say, sometimes the broken things are the most beautiful." He knew he was throwing away his advantage. Knew he was walking into ruin. But the sight of her, this forgotten star dimming quietly into the void, was something he could not, would not ignore. Slowly, he reached out, letting his fingertips brush the frozen skin of her wrist. The moment they touched, her body shivered, a faint, involuntary reaction, but real enough to punch through the numbing despair around them. And somewhere, deep in the nerve net of the lumen vault, a ripple began. Small. Fragile. But unstoppable. The moment her silvery violet skin quivered beneath Kale's fingertips, something awoke, not just in her, but in the suffocating air of the vault itself. As if every molecule shuddered, as if the corroded walls could no longer contain the secret buried within. Kale felt it, not with his eyes, but with the battle-hardened instincts that had kept him alive through countless wars. He kept holding her hand, a hand so fragile and thin that every knuckle, every vein seemed to pulse weakly under her shimmering skin. Her body was cold, but deep within that coldness, he could feel a feeble spark of warmth. A heartbeat. A resistance. Nearer, he breathed her name, as if speaking it aloud could call her spirit back from the abyss. A soft electronic beep flickered from the rusted console nearby. Warning, low-grade neurodisruption detected. Emotional network ripple forming. Spread risk, 0.02%. Kale glanced at the countdown on his wrist scanner. Time was bleeding away fast. Yet in his heart, the decision was already made. There was no turning back. Carefully, he withdrew a slender plasma blade from his belt and began to cut through the aging silver cuffs. The plasma hissed as it sliced cleanly through the electromag alloy, a thin glow lighting up the cramped room. The shackle snapped and fell away with a harsh metallic clatter. Nira instinctively flinched, curling in on herself, as if expecting a blow. Kale didn't move. He knelt beside her, his voice low, gentle, steady, the kind of voice one might use to coax a wounded bird from hiding. "No one will hurt you again," he said, each word a silent vow carved into the marrow of his bones. For a long moment, she remained motionless. Then, slowly, painfully, her eyes opened. Those eyes, shimmering silver, tinged with a faint purple hue, locked onto him. They weren't empty like the others. Within them lay suspicion, pain, terror, and somewhere, buried under it all, a thin, trembling thread of hope. "You." Her voice was raw, cracked from disuse, barely a whisper. "You're not one of them." Kale shook his head slowly, never breaking eye contact. "No. I'm here to get you out." She blinked once, confusion flickering across her face, as if the words didn't belong to any language she had ever been taught. Freedom? Rescue? These were fairy tales from another universe. Kale extended his hand, not touching her, just holding it out, a silent invitation, no force, no command. Nira stared at it, hesitant. Then, with a courage so delicate it was almost heartbreaking, she reached out and placed her trembling fingers into his palm. The moment their hands touched, Kale felt a jolt, not of electricity, but of life. Raw, stubborn, beautiful life refusing to be extinguished. He closed his fingers gently around hers, sealing the unspoken promise between them. "Come with me," he whispered. And for the first time, he saw the corner of her mouth twitch, a small, almost imperceptible attempt at a nod. Fragile, but real. Supporting her carefully, Kale slid his arm around her waist, feeling how light she was, how brittle. She staggered when he helped her stand, bare feet slipping on the cold floor, but she didn't fall. In her trembling, in her faltering steps, there was something else, the faint, stubborn beat of a soul reclaiming itself. He shrugged off his maintenance jacket and wrapped it around her, shielding her frail frame from the cold that seemed determined to seep into her bones. Together, they moved out into the dim corridor, his steps steady, hers faltering but resolute. Every footfall echoed down the endless hallways lined with glass coffins, stirring the stale air thick with the scent of ozone and dead machines. But Kale felt something else stirring too. Inside those other pods, those other eclipsed ones thought lost, eyes were flickering open. Fingers twitched against the cold glass. Faint pulses of light, like forgotten stars, began to shimmer beneath their translucent skins. The ripple had begun. Not just in one lost soul, but across hundreds, perhaps thousands. And no force in the galaxy would be enough to stop it now. They stepped out of that prison room, two fragile silhouettes blending into the endless corridors of the Lumen Vault. Beneath the pale, flickering neon lights, Nira staggered beside Kale, wrapped awkwardly in his oversized technician's jacket, her bare feet barely whispering against the cold floor. She clutched his hand tightly, as if terrified that letting go even for a second would dissolve her back into dust, swallowed once again by the heartless belly of this place. Every step they took echoed like a hammer blow against the vault's oppressive silence, unsettling the stagnant air thick with ozone and decaying machinery. Along the hallways flanking them, the containment pods stretched endlessly, each one housing a motionless eclipsed, their beautiful faces frozen behind misted glass, their bodies wired into the cold machinery that drained their souls. But Kale could feel it. Something had changed. Inside those pods, subtle movements began. A blink. A twitch of a finger. A faint glimmer of light pulsing under skin once thought dead. The tiny ripple of awakening that had started with Nero was spreading, like a pebble dropped into a stagnant pond, sending ripples wider and wider, until no surface remained undisturbed. Kale tightened his grip on Nira's hand, picking up the pace. He knew time was running out. The vault's automated systems would soon register the anomaly spreading through the emotional network. And when that happened, Ascendancy's wrath would come crashing down like a hammer from the heavens. But it wasn't just them that noticed the change. Within the pods, behind the layers of glass and steel, slumbering minds were stirring. An eclipsed with deep azure skin blinked dazedly, placing a trembling hand against the inside of their pod. Twin figures with misty purple skin pressed their foreheads together, bioluminescent threads linking their hearts with gentle waves. Kale didn't need to issue any commands. There was no time, and more importantly, no need. The awakening was organic. It was primal. It was inevitable. As Kale swept through the auxiliary maintenance route, his ears strained for any sign of movement ahead. Static crackled over the internal announcement system, broken and garbled. Warning, abnormal emotional fluctuations detected in Sector 7. Warning, anomalous resonance patterns spreading. Immediate response teams deployed. They had been discovered. Kale yanked Nira into a darkened alcove just before a patrol unit rounded the corner. Ascendancy soldiers, clad in sleek gray battle armor, marched past in formation, plasma rifles gripped in lifeless hands, their faces hidden behind featureless helmets. Human-shaped machines, bred to obey without feeling. Nira trembled in his arms, not from fear, but from rage. The memory of 1,000 indignities, 1,000 years of stolen freedom, burned behind her silver eyes. Kale felt the light beneath her skin flicker, stronger this time, like a heart beating against the bars of a cage. "Stay calm," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "We're almost there. I swear." He pressed her deeper into the shadows, drawing a homemade electromagnetic grenade from his belt. The device was crude, but it didn't need elegance. Just effectiveness. Waiting for the soldiers to pass, Kale flicked the activation switch and lobbed the grenade through the narrowest gap. A faint click. A burst of electromagnetic interference exploded in silence, a wave of invisible force washing over the patrol. Instantly, their suits and weapons seized up, systems fried. Soldiers stumbled, collapsed like marionettes with their strings cut, howling in confusion as their neural augments short-circuit. Kale didn't hesitate. He scooped Nira up into his arms and sprinted past the fallen soldiers. She wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, her breath ragged, but her eyes burning with a fierce, undeniable will to live. Behind them, the eclipse continued to awaken. A woman with sea-green skin shattered the glass of her pod with a bloodied fist, her eyes blazing like twin stars. Blood streamed down her fingers, but she didn't care. She stepped forward into a world she had been denied for too long. Kale didn't dare slow down to watch. The wave had started. Nothing could stop it now. They veered down a maintenance shaft, the flickering emergency lights casting long, twisted shadows. The very structure of the vault, once stabilized by the emotional siphon systems, now groaned under the strain. Cracks spiderwebbed along the walls. The floors trembled underfoot. With every heartbeat, the ripples grew. Sirens blared. Red warning lights painted the world in feverish strokes of blood. The death knell of a machine-built hell. "They are waking up," Nira gasped against his shoulder, her voice thin but resolute. Kale nodded, his jaw clenched tight. "And we're not going to let anyone stop them." They charged forward into the chaos, Kale's body shielded around Nira, Nira's light growing ever stronger with every step. Behind them, the vault screamed. And ahead of them, somewhere beyond the crumbling ruins of oppression, freedom waited. The true battle had only just begun. The quiet tremor rumbling through the heart of Lumen Vault could no longer be hidden. Cracks fissured along the walls, the towering pillars groaned under invisible pressure, the lights overhead flickered like dying stars. Beneath a once pristine facade of Avares 4, the collapse of an empire had begun, not by the force of a conquering army, but by the will of those it had once deemed worthless. Kale carried Nira through the trembling corridors, her body frail but her light growing stronger with every heartbeat. Behind them, hundreds of newly awakened Eclipse followed, souls who had once been silenced, now stumbling into a world they had never been allowed to believe in. Some collapsed to their knees, clutching the ground as if needing to feel its reality, its weight. Others stumbled but rose again, their faces battered but alive. And in every single one of them, Kale saw the same glimmer, a fire no longer crushed into silence. Alarms screamed overhead. The emergency response protocols of the Ascendancy were in full effect. Drones screamed across the ceilings, security systems came online, ready to smother the insurrection. Kale knew they wouldn't make it far without a fight. At the end of the main corridor, Blocking the only access to the emergency exit, stood an entire detachment of Ascendancy reaction forces, sleek battle armor gleaming under flickering lights, plasma rifles leveled and ready to fire. Standing at their head was a high-ranking officer, his polished helmet reflecting the crimson alarms. His amplified voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Surrender immediately. The Eclipsed have no right to autonomy. The Eclipsed are the property of the Ascendancy. Nero leaned heavily against Kale, her body trembling, but her silver eyes burned with a ferocity that even Kale had never seen before. The light under her skin flared, wrapping her like a living aurora. Kale squeezed her hand, whispered against her temple. This is your moment. Lead them. Nero looked up at him, startled for a heartbeat, then nodded. She let go of his hand and stepped forward, small, fragile, but radiant. Behind her, the newly awakened Eclipsed gathered, their bodies flickering with nascent bioluminescence, pulsing like a single, massive heart coming alive for the first time. Nero walked, barefoot and trembling, down the middle of the corridor, facing the Ascendancy soldiers alone. Every step she took seemed to push the darkness back just a little more. She stopped within speaking distance of the officer, raised her chin, and spoke, her voice small, but carrying with the unstoppable weight of a rising tide. We, she said, are not your property? Silence fell like a heavy shroud. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the officer made a sharp gesture. Eliminate them. The rifles charged, glowing with deadly plasma energy. But before a single shot could find its mark, Nero closed her eyes and raised her hands. From her, from every Eclipse behind her, a massive pulse of raw emotion burst forth, not rage, not fear, but something purer, defiance, hope, the unbreakable yearning for life. The wave slammed into the soldiers like a tsunami. Plasma bolts fizzled into nothingness mid-air. Soldiers staggered, their stiff, programmed minds overwhelmed by a flood of emotions they had been trained to suppress, terror, guilt, sorrow, memories they had buried too deep. One by one, the soldiers crumbled. Some dropped their weapons and fled, howling like wounded animals. Some collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads, weeping uncontrollably. The Ascendancy's finest warriors, broken not by bullets or bombs, but by the simple, overwhelming force of feeling. Kale watched in stunned silence, heart hammering. They had not needed violence. They had not needed death. They had won with nothing but the truth of their own humanity. When the last soldier fled, leaving their weapons abandoned on the bloodless battlefield, Kale surged forward. He reached nearer just as she staggered, drained from the massive outpouring of energy. He caught her in his arms before she could fall, cradling her against his chest as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. You did it, he whispered, voice thick with emotion. You led them. Nero looked up at him, her silver eyes shimmering with exhaustion, but also with an unbreakable joy. No, she murmured. We did. They didn't waste time. With the path clear, Kale, Nero, and the liberated Eclipse fled the vault, their footsteps echoing down the empty corridors one last time. The first breath of open air hit them like a baptism. Cold, sharp, filled with a scent of dust and ozone, but it was real. It was free. Above them, the artificial sky of Avares 4 flickered and cracked, revealing glimpses of the real heavens beyond, endless, uncharted, waiting. Behind them, the Lumen Vault groaned and crumbled into silence, a tomb for an empire that had fed on the suffering of its children for too long. And before them, under that broken, starlit sky, stretched a future yet unwritten. They had made their first stand. And they would never kneel again. The sky above Avares 4 did not greet them with fanfare or showers of radiant light. It greeted them with a biting, metallic wind laced with a scent of scorched metal and dust, and the bleak, jagged silhouette of a world crumbling under its own weight. The once pristine towers of the Ascendancy now leaned precariously, cracked and broken. The polished streets were fractured veins cutting through desolation. The manufactured paradise was dying, rotting from within. Kale tightened his grip on Nira's hand, feeling the tremors still running through her slender fingers. Behind them, hundreds of Eclipsed stumbled forward, souls who had tasted freedom for the first time and clung to it with a ferocity born of lifetimes in chains. Some fell to their knees to press trembling hands into the soil, grounding themselves in a reality that no longer belonged to their oppressors. Others lifted their faces to the sky, breathing the bitter air like it was the sweetest thing they had ever known. None of them wore armor. None carried heavy weapons. Only Kale bore a weapon at all, an aging plasma pistol strapped to his thigh, not as an instrument of vengeance, but as a shield to guard this fragile rebirth. Above them, alarms howled like wounded animals. Drones streaked through the atmosphere, mechanical sentinels shrieking their cold warnings. Kale knew what was coming. The Ascendancy would not let them go so easily. He turned to Nira, their gazes locking in silent understanding. They would have to fight, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had never been given the chance. Kale drew the pistol, checked the energy cell, then raised his voice over the rising cacophony. Group in threes. Move north, head for the old Sector 7 refugee station. We don't fight to destroy. We fight to survive. There was no hesitation. The newly awakened Eclipsed responded without question, scattering into small units, watching each other's backs as they moved. Nira led the first group, her skin pulsing with soft light, sending silent emotional signals of courage and determination to those around her. She had become more than a symbol, she was a beacon. Kale led the second group, weaving them through the skeletal remains of broken buildings and shattered transport lanes. He shielded the weaker ones, helped those who stumbled. Not a soldier leading an army, but a brother among brothers and sisters. Then, the ground shook violently. A roar tore through the air as an Ascendancy assault unit thundered into view, armored walkers, bristling with plasma turrets, stomping through the wreckage like ancient beasts of war. Kale cursed under his breath. They were outgunned, outmatched. But then, from behind him, a miracle unfolded. A handful of Eclipsed, those who had awoken earliest, stepped forward. No armor. No shields. Only the shimmering, living light under their skins. They linked hands, forming a human chain. And together, they closed their eyes. From their joined bodies erupted a pulse, a tidal wave of pure, raw emotion, unleashed not through weapons, but through their very existence. The plasma rounds streaming toward them dissolved midair, melting into harmless particles. The walkers' control systems spasmed and died. Ascendancy soldiers screamed as their implants overloaded, bombarded by memories, grief, guilt, emotions they had been trained to crush. Kale watched in awe as the machines of war, invincible and unassailable, collapsed under the one force they had no defense against, humanity. No shots fired. No blood spilled. Only the unstoppable flood of truth. Move. Kale barked, rallying the survivors. They surged forward, weaving through the wreckage, carrying their wounded, lifting their fallen. Behind them, the battlefield lay silent, not with the silence of death, but with the silence of a world waking up. By the time the artificial sunset bled across the sky, staining the clouds a deep, mournful crimson, Kale, Nira, and the ragtag tribe of freed souls reached the edge of the city. Before them stretched the vast white desert, a wasteland once used for Ascendancy weapons testing, now abandoned to time and memory. Nira sank down onto a boulder, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Kale dropped beside her, his own body burning with fatigue, but his heart still steady, still whole. He wiped the sweat from her brow, his touch tender. She looked up at him, her eyes silver and luminous against the dying light. "We made it," Kale murmured, wonder threading through his voice. Nira smiled, a small, weary smile that shone brighter than any sunrise. "No," she whispered. "We've only just begun." And so, at the ragged edge of a dying empire, under a broken sky and upon bloodless soil, a new army was born. Not an army of conquerors, but of survivors. Not an army built on hatred, but on love, on defiance, on the unbreakable will to live. From the ashes of the ascendancy, a new dawn began to rise. Carried not on the wings of tyranny, but on the hearts of those who had dared to feel, to dream, and to be free. The first night beyond the crumbling city, under the unfamiliar stars of Avary's 4, there were no songs of triumph, no victory chants, no grand celebrations. Only the soft sound of breathing, exhausted but free, filled the cool night air. Those who had fled the vault huddled together beneath makeshift shelters of scavenged metal and scrap cloth. They were battered, bleeding, but alive, truly alive for the first time in their existence. Kale sat quietly atop a small sand dune, the wind tugging gently at his worn jacket. His gaze drifted toward the distant skyline where the twisted remnants of ascendancy towers loomed like the broken ribs of a dying beast. He could still hear the echoes of the vault's collapse, a requiem not just for a building, but for an entire way of life that had thrived on cruelty and silence. Beside him, Nero leaned against his side, her silver hair tangled by the breeze, her breathing steady but shallow with fatigue. The glow under her skin had dimmed to a soft, comforting pulse, no longer burning with the fever of rebellion but humming with a steady, enduring light. They had escaped. But survival was not enough. Freedom was not a single moment of defiance. It was a promise. A seed. And it needed to be nurtured. The days that followed were brutal. There were no architects to build grand cities. No armies to defend them. No vast stores of supplies or technology to ease their burdens. Just hands, calloused, bruised, trembling, learning how to dig wells in barren ground, how to weave shelters from discarded remnants, how to find food in a world that had been bled dry by a heartless empire. Kale became a leader not by command, but by example. He carried the wounded. He dug the trenches. He rationed his food and shared his water. He stood watch when others collapsed from exhaustion. Nira became their heart. At night, by the firelight of salvaged energy cells, she sat with the trembling, the broken, the ones too scared to believe they had truly been freed. She listened to their nightmares, held their hands when they cried, taught them how to smile again, taught them that hope was not something fragile, but something fierce, something that could burn as hot as any star. From their pain and ashes, a community began to grow. Not a kingdom. Not an empire. Just a gathering of souls who refused to bow again. Crops sprouted in the salt-choked earth. Homes, clumsy, crooked, but full of laughter, rose where once there had been only dust. Children born under new skies grew up knowing the taste of freedom, their skins shimmering with the bioluminescent echoes of the eclipsed who had first dared to dream. But the old world was not yet finished with them. Ascendancy remnants, broken but vicious, still haunted the edges of the wastelands. Raiders. Mercenaries. Remnants who would rather drag the world back into chains than see it reborn. One night, as the pale moons hung low over the camp, the first real test of their new society came. A raiding party of former Ascendancy soldiers attacked under the cover of darkness, armed with scavenged plasma rifles and fueled by hatred and fear. Kale was first on his feet, weapon drawn. Nero was not far behind, but instead of reaching for a gun, she clutched the small, battered memory pendant she always wore, a repository of every soul they had lost, every name that could not be forgotten. The people of the camp, old, young, wounded, healed, rallied not because they were ordered to, but because they chose to. They fought back not with hatred, but with a stubborn, burning love for the fragile world they were building. It was not an easy battle. Blood was shed. Tears fell. But when the sun rose, casting golden light over the battered camp, they were still standing. Together. Stronger. Kale stood atop a dune overlooking the settlement, chest heaving, sweat and dirt streaking his face. Beside him, Nira slipped her hand into his, her fingers calloused, scarred, but unbreakably warm. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "We survived," she murmured. Kale looked down at the bustling settlement below, at the repaired huts, the laughing children, the fields stubbornly clawing life from ruined soil. "No," he said, voice rough with emotion. "We lived." Nira smiled, the first true, unburdened smile he had seen from her since the day he found her shackled and broken in the vault. And beneath the endless sky of Avaries 4, they stood together, not as prisoners, not as rebels, but as builders of a new world. Not perfect. Not easy. But real. And this time, no empire, no tyrant, no darkness could take it away from them. 10 years had passed since the day they escaped the Lumen Vault. 10 years since Nira first took Kale's hand in that suffocating, lightless corridor. And the world had changed beyond recognition. Avaries 4 was no longer the planet of light, not the hollow, glittering prison the Ascendancy had once built. The sky, once veiled under layers of artificial haze, now stretched wide and open, vast oceans of deep blue and fields of starlight. No more silver towers piercing false skies. No more crystal boulevards built upon silent suffering. In their place, villages blooming across meadows of soft green grass, streams of clear water weaving among orchards of luminous saronwood trees, marketplaces alive with the laughter of children who had never known the weight of a chain. At the heart of this reborn world, atop a gentle hill carpeted in wildflowers, stood a house built of stone and wood, simple, sturdy, full of life. Lanterns crafted from bioluminescent crystals lined the paths, casting warm, living light each evening. From the porch, one could see all the way across the vast plain, where fields of energy grain shimmered under the twin moons, and the saronwood forests rolled out like silver rivers to the horizon. Kale stood on that porch, one hand resting on the rough wooden railing, gazing quietly out over the land they had carved with their own blood and hope. His once black hair now bore streaks of silver, but his sharp, ocean-deep eyes remained unchanged, the eyes of a man who had stared down the darkness and refused to blink. Beside him, Nira sat curled on a broad wooden chair, a well-worn journal resting open on her lap. The pages told their story, of pain, of rebellion, of impossible survival. Her silver hair fell loose around her shoulders, glinting softly in the twilight. The bioluminescence that had once been a prison marker now shimmered beneath her skin like a living constellation, subtle, beautiful, unbreakable. Down below, on the soft grass, a young boy darted back and forth, laughing as he chased glowing insects that danced in the evening air. Iron Veil Arden, 8 years old, a bright comet born of 2 broken stars. His silver hair floated behind him like a banner, and beneath his skin, faint rivers of light pulsed joyfully, an inheritance of hope from a mother who had refused to die and a father who had refused to surrender. He spun around, waving wildly. "Mom! Dad! Look at me!" Kale smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Nira closed her journal, watching her son with eyes so full of love they seemed ready to spill over. "I used to think," she said softly, resting her chin on her knees, "that all we could ever do was run. That we'd never have a home. Never have this." Cale turned to her, his smile gentle, the deep lines on his face etched by years of hard-won peace, not regret. "You were wrong," he said, voice low and sure. "You didn't just run. You fought. You lit the first flame. And everything here, every laugh, every breath, is because of that." Nira smiled, a small, private smile, and slipped her arm around his waist. He pulled her close, resting his chin atop her head. They said nothing more. They didn't need to. Every promise they had made, every sacrifice they had bled for, every dream they had dared to believe, lived, and breathed in the world around them. In the distance, other villages dotted the horizon, small communities connected not by borders or banners, but by threads of trust, by shared songs and traded stories. Children of human and eclipse bloodlines grew together, their skins gleaming softly with the light of a future untouched by Ascendancy's cruelty. No more walls. No more chains. Only life, messy, beautiful, imperfect life. As the twin moons rose, bathing the land in silver and gold, Cale, Nira, and Iron sat together on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. The boy leaned his head against his mother's shoulder, his voice small but brimming with wonder. "Mom, Dad, why are there so many stars?" Nira stroked his hair, her touch as soft as the falling night. "Because," she whispered, "every star is a story. A hope. A soul that once fought to be free." Cale leaned forward, tapping the boy's nose with a calloused finger. "And now," he said, voice rough with emotion, "you're one of them too." Iron giggled, his laugh twinkling among the stars. "Someday," he said, "I'll have a story too." Cale and Nero looked at each other over the boy's head, their hearts swelling beyond the limits of flesh. "You already do," Nero whispered. And beneath the endless, starlit sky, on a world once broken and now reborn, a new story began. A story of defiance. A story of healing. A story of love. A story that would shine, forever, among the stars.